Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our 2023 Tropical Weather Outlook. My name is Andrea Berg, and I will be your host for today. Just have a few housekeeping notes to go over with you before we get started. First, our webinar is being recorded, so we will send out a link to the recording to everybody who registered for the webinar in about 3 to 5 days from now. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat feature and message me as the host. We have reserved some time at the end of the webinar to go over any questions you may have. So please use the Q&A feature on the right-hand side of your screen to submit your questions, and we'll go through them then. So I just want to quickly introduce our presenters today. First, we have Nathan Hamlin. He is a weather risk communicator doing long-range forecasting. Stephen Strum, our weather risk senior manager, again for long-range forecasting. We're also joined by Brad Nelson, a solution engineer, and Kevin Stinson, a global commercial manager, who will jump on towards the end with myself to do a panel discussion on the impacts of the summer and tropical weather on your industries. So with that, I am going to turn the ball over to Nathan.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you everybody for joining us. There is a lot to cover today. So let's go over what our primary goal is always, is to empower you with intelligent and actionable weather insights for the 2023 tropical and summer season. So in order to do that, we'll go through the following topics. We'll go over 2022, the tropical season highlights to give us a basis as to our comparison of this year's forecast. And then we'll go over the 2023 expected seasonal influences. And we'll compare that to some model tropical parameter forecasts, and we'll wrap that all up into a DTN tropical season outlook. And then I'll hand it over to Steve, who will go over the summer season outlook, and then we'll go through our panel discussion. And we'll have at least some time at the end for some questions. If you want to submit those through the Q&A section, that would be great. We will be happy to get to as many of them as we can during the hour. So let's start with the 2022 tropical season recap. And the 2022 storm season had 14 named storms, 8 of which were hurricanes, and 2 of which were major hurricanes, which were category 3 or higher. And we had 3 U.S. named storm landfalls, and 2 of those were hurricanes, and they were pretty impactful. We had over $120 billion in damage, which is the 3rd highest on record. On the other hand, this is our first season since 2014 with no storms prior to June 1st. So we broke a pretty long stretch there of those. And let's go over a little bit of climatology. And these are named storms and hurricanes by year. So the greens are named storms, the yellows are hurricanes, and the reds are major hurricanes. And the lines that you see there are 10-year averages. So there's a lot of ups and downs. If you look at the green line, it kind of goes up starting during the late 80s and 90s and then continuing through the 2000s through today with a lot more named storms. But if you look at the corresponding hurricanes and major hurricanes, there's not much movement there. Matter of fact, they came down during the 70s and 80s, and they've come back up a bit in the 2000s, but more or less they've been kind of steady. And kind of the reason for that is the fact that we have satellites and all kinds of observing equipment with better technology today that we can observe some of the smaller storms out there that maybe we couldn't have observed back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But by and large, we haven't had a major uptick overall in the amount of hurricanes or major hurricanes since 1950. So let's go through a few individual storms here. And the first one was Tropical Storm Colin, which came in July 1st and 2nd. This was a minimal tropical storm with max winds of 40 miles per hour. The landfall was in Huntington Island, South Carolina. It didn't do much damage, but there was 1 drowning fatality in North Carolina. It did produce 2 to 7 inches of rain in South Carolina, mostly along the coast, the central coast. So this one wasn't a huge deal. However, this one was. We fast forward to the end of September, and we had major Hurricane Ian. September 23 to 30, So we had a long track storm go through the Caribbean. It turned across western Cuba, came in across Florida, just south of Tampa, in the Fort Myers region, and went across the peninsula and had a second landfall in Georgetown, South Carolina. The first landfall was pretty major, 145 miles per hour, Category 4 storm, and that caused 160 fatalities. So we had $113 billion in damage, most of which occurred with the storm surge because it just happened to go in the wrong area. 10 to 15-foot storm surge south of the eye, so that's very difficult for any area to handle, let alone low-lying coastal areas that are populated. 21.49 inches of rain in Daytona Beach, Florida. And if you look at the wind map on the top right-hand corner, you'll notice here there's a lot of red colors across the central Florida peninsula. So a lot of wind damage occurred, more or less in populated areas of central Florida. So this is a very highly impactful storm. The power was out for a long time for some people. And hopefully we don't see another one like it again anytime soon. And then later on, November 7th to the 11th, we have Hurricane Nicole with maximum winds of 75 miles per hour. So this was a minimal hurricane, Category 1. Landfall was North Hutchinson Island, Florida. It still caused $1 billion in damage, so it doesn't really have to be a major hurricane to produce a lot of damage. 11 fatalities. Orlando, Florida had over 7 inches of rain, and this is only the third time on record that a November hurricane hit the state of Florida. So it is rare that late in the year to get that much of a highly impactful storm. And then of course you see the track going inland along the Appalachians, so there's some flooding issues that occurred inland as well. Let's look at some U.S. hurricane landfall trends. And on the left, you see U.S. landfalling hurricanes from 1990 to 2020. And the red line is the trend line. And notice that's starting to go down a little bit. So we had more hurricanes come on shore back more or less in the early 1900s than we have as we have recently. And you notice there was a stretch there from about 2008 through 2007 all the way through about 2015 where it was very quiet in terms of landfalling storms. And if you look at the right, this is the major landfalling hurricanes, and these are Category 3 or higher, and it's pretty steady, maybe even dropping a little bit, but there was a stretch from about 2006 to about 2017 where no major hurricanes made landfall. That was the longest stretch on record. So no major upticks. We're not getting a lot more of these types of storms, nor are they making landfall more often. It's more or less a steady slog with some breaks in there. Well, another impact from these storms you have to take a look at is tornadoes. And these are all the different tornado reports that occurred from 1950 to 2007 as a result of tropical cyclones. And 6% of all reported U.S. tornadoes are as a result of these. So that's no small number. They do produce a lot of tornadoes to the south and east of the path. And doesn't even need to be a very strong storm. Even weak remnants can do it well beyond the landfall point. So you can see some dots getting into Arkansas, Indiana, Ohio, but more or less these reports are where you would expect them to be, closer to the coast. So that's one aspect of tropical cyclones that can be a bigger impact a little bit further inland. Also rainfall. What you see here is the highest rainfall accumulation from a tropical cyclone in a state from 1940 to 2019. So each state has higher ones. And you can see North Dakota has an inch and a half there, or almost. But you can see Iowa 9 inches, Illinois 10. That's Audrey back in the day. So I mean, even though you think of hurricanes as a coastal impact, the remnants can go further inland and they can produce a lot of rain and produce flooding problems that are pretty extreme. For example, look at Hurricane Harvey in Texas, 2017, 60 inches of rain. That is, nobody can handle that. So even if you're not right on the coast, hurricanes and the remnants thereof can certainly cause a lot of trouble. So important historical factors. The U.S. has experienced a period of fewer landfalling hurricanes during the past decade compared to the last 150 years. As mentioned earlier, no major hurricanes have made U.S. landfall October 2005 to August 2017. That's a record span. We've had 6 since, so it's starting to catch up a little bit. But we did have that long stretch without any landfalls. Impacts in the storm of sufficient intensity located in exactly the wrong place have shown that disruptions can be pretty extreme. Sandy and Harvey can certainly, anybody who was associated with those two storms can tell you that. As landfalls and intensities match up with historical distributions, the cost will probably be much greater due to growth and exposure and the vulnerability and, of course, the wealth as the land values increase with time and more people and infrastructure gets located closer and closer to the coast. A landfall in areas of dense population and infrastructure increases the threat for widespread property damage and loss of life. And there is some evidence for a recent trend of storms to stall or slow near North American coastal areas, and that is leading to some higher rainfall totals. And that was certainly the case with Hurricane Harvey. So with that historical perspective, let's move on to the tropical forecast here. And let's go over some important seasonal factors to start off. Tropical development is enhanced when ocean temperatures are warmer than average, so more fuel for storms to work with. Now we talk about vertical wind shear. So this is basically the change of wind with height, so wind direction or wind speed. If wind doesn't change much with speed or direction with height, that's minimal wind shear, and that is what you want to have more organized storms. However, if you have a lot of change, different directions or different speeds with height, that can disorganize storms, cause them to tilt or even tear apart a little bit. So you want minimal change. And you want large scale rising air motion present around it, so you don't want to be inhibited by sinking air. And when those favorable conditions develop across our main development region, we refer to as the MDR, which is off the West African coast all the way through the Caribbean. If you can get a stronger and wetter West African monsoon to deposit disturbances out over those favorable areas in the red, you can certainly get more and more storms and stronger storms. So that's what we refer to as the MDR, because those disturbances that come off of Africa will track right across that area during the hurricane season. So let's take a look at the main seasonal drivers. And one thing that's going to happen this summer that hasn't happened in the last few years is we're going to have El Nino develop during the summer and will strengthen through the fall season. So what you see here on the right-hand side is a forecast for sea surface temperature anomalies from July through September. And what you see here is a lot of red off the South American coast in the equatorial Pacific. So El Nino is going to show up and it's going to keep developing. But at the same time, we're going to have warm Atlantic Ocean temperatures, which is indicative of the warm AMO, which is the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, and then the negative phase of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, or the PDO. And what that basically means is that warm water in the North Pacific is in place, but there's some cooler water right along the U.S. West Coast. So that gradient is a cooler or the negative form of the PDO. So what we like to do is look in the record for years that were similar to this one, what we expect coming up, and that can give us some clues as to what kind of weather we might expect. So let's take a minute and focus on ENSO through December 2023. And again, El Nino will develop and strengthen during the summer, fall. And these are ENSO forecasts for water temperature anomalies from modeling centers all across the world. And what you need for an El Nino is the average temperature to be 0.5 degrees Celsius above normal or higher, where that red line is. And most of the guidance is above that. So we're in the neutral category as we speak right now, but we're headed towards El Nino. We'll probably reach it early in the summer, and it will mature late summer, especially during the fall. That thick maroon line is the model average overall, at least the dynamical model average, and that it's going to be more reliable in this case. And you can see solidly in the El Nino camp that the July, August, and the September, and the August, September, October. So between the July and October, solidly in the El Nino camp. The statistical models will catch up eventually, I believe, and they've been trending warmer. But we've noticed here over the past couple of months that this has trended a bit warmer. So we're thinking that El Nino will be in place. So what does ENSO do? Why is it so important? Well, if you have an El Nino, it tends to cut down on the number of storms that can occur during a given year. So what you see here on this chart are all El Nino years neutral years and La Nina years broken up. We haven't broken up since 1950 and 1995 to get maybe a little better idea of how it's changed with time. So since we're expecting El Nino, we'll go over that first. You can see that the average since 1995 is somewhere around 11 storms, and the max that's ever occurred is 15. So El Nino tends to knock things down a little bit. Hurricanes, the average is 5. Major hurricanes, the average is 2. So there's pretty strong evidence that El Nino tends to cut down on storm totals. Neutral, Enso, and La Nina is those states tend to increase storm numbers, and that's why we're a little bit busier the past 3 years, especially 2020 and 2021. So we're going to be losing that. So ENSO strongly suggests that we're going to have less storms this year. So let's take a look at some analogs. And again, the 1991 to 2020 historical average of 14 named storms, 7 hurricanes, and 3 majors. And we'll compare that to the 95 to present El Nino years. And again, named storms for 11, hurricanes 4.6, and majors of 2.6. Our 2023 analog years are comparable. They're a little bit below the average, 13.6, 6.5, and 3.0 respectively. They're just slightly above the El Nino year average here, so that's 1995. And here's some top analog years, just a sampling. We usually use 10 of them. Here are the top 6. And way back in 1951 is our first analog. And you notice here there's a lot of recurving storms, and then there's one or 2 tracks that went westward into the Gulf. And then 09 and 06, see there's recurving storms in there. Pretty quiet year in 09. But the one thing you start to notice here, and I'll show you in the next slide, but there's a few, the northeastern Gulf and the recurving storms are a little bit more of a common impact here from all of these. So let's take a look at the analog track density anomalies. And it's a little pixelated, but I think it shows a pretty good, tells a pretty good story. So where you see the oranges and the reds are areas where there was more, greater track density. So tracks tended to show up in these areas. And then where the purples and blues are, the tracks pretty much were below normal or very, less than they otherwise would be. So a couple things stand out. The northeastern Gulf off the Florida, southeastern U.S. coast, a little bit better chance there. And then, of course, you see the orange little thing. You can follow it like a track. So I outlined it in a red arrow there, so you can see the recurving tracks around there. So anything that can come out of the MDR up and come northward will recurve outwards here. And of course, you see the blues near the northeastern coast. So kind of reduced tracks near the northeast. So those are the few things that stand out from the analogs. Let's take a look at the current sea surface temperature anomalies, and that's pretty much looks like what the forecast is showing for the most part. You see a lot of warm water right now in the MDR region. The Caribbean's not quite as warm, but the Eastern Pacific in the tropics definitely very warm. But there's a lot of cool water near the west coast right now, so that's forecast to warm up during the summer. But that negative PDO signature is strong right now in the ENSO. We're just about ready to hit El Nino. There's a lot of, waters are all warming in there, especially near the South American coast. So we're on track. But the other thing I want to point out is there's a lot of warm water right in the Gulf of Mexico and right off the southeast coast. And that's very important to the forecast coming up. And zooming in, and we're going to use the CFS model here during the August, September, and October period. And the Caribbean, maybe not all that warm, but there's a lot of warm water into the MDR and then the Gulf and then off the southeastern coast. So that's a favorable aspect for more storm development. However, on the right is the shear period for that, or the shear forecast for the August, September, October period. And we see those reds, that is above average wind shear. And again, we talked about what wind shear does, is that there's a lot of it around, that storms tend to become less organized. They may not even form at all. And right from the Caribbean through the MDR, there's above average wind shear. So that tells you that the model thinks that there could be a potential for less storms in that region. However, taking a look at the Gulf of Mexico and off the southeastern coast, there's a little hole in there, and there's near to below average shear. And it's right in that region where those tracks were in the model, or the analogs there. So happen to notice that, and kind of lines up with what the analogs are trying to tell us. So it's a bit of a mixed signal. But we are going to have to watch areas a little bit closer to the coast. And here's the rainfall forecast from the ECMWF for August through October during the peak part of the hurricane season. And sure enough, you can see the dry brown colors in the Caribbean Sea heading out towards the MDR, and then the green wet colors in that same section from the southeastern coast through Florida and the northeastern Gulf of Mexico. So that is just another signal that there could be a little bit more activity potentially in those areas, even though the overall basin looks relatively quiet. So from the environment standpoint, the summary, El Nino is less favorable for tropical development, and that's pretty clear in the numbers from the past. And our past analog years indicate slightly below average tropical activity can be anticipated. So the warm ocean temperatures are anticipated during the heart of the hurricane season, which are favorable conditions for development. Wind shear is unfavorable in the MDR for development. However, it's more favorable in the Gulf of Mexico and off the southeast coast. So we'll call that mixed signals. Drier than normal precipitation expected in the Caribbean MDR, but wetter conditions are anticipated in the Gulf of Mexico and off the southeast coast. So these somewhat conflicting factors could point towards average or slightly below average number of storms in the 2023 season. So where might these storms go? Well, maybe we can use our analogs to predict the storm tracks. Do the best we can anyway. And here's a little bit of a comparison. So the lower landfall period from 2006 to 2016, we're going to use 500 millibar heights as kind of a proxy for steering flow. And the thing that stands out in the average of those 11 years is that you see an area of low pressure right along the eastern seaboard. And when air flows around that, that basically acts like a brick wall. So any storm that tries to come westward across the MDR is brought northward and then brought eastward and taken away out to sea. So it doesn't, and that's why there was a lot of storms that weren't quite able to come on shore. 2020 was a big change. We had a lot of storms, and a lot of them came on shore. And this is how things changed. Look at the area of high pressure off the eastern seaboard into the Canadian Maritimes. That acts as a kind of a brick wall of its own. So take the same storms and that come westward through the MDR into the Caribbean. There's a little trough of low pressure more or less in the central part of the country. So that draws it northward. And then then they're not allowed to escape to the east because that big high pressure is blocking them. So that is a big difference between the quiet period and the active period. So how does the 2023 analog average compare to that? Well, there's some differences here. The first thing you notice, though, is that there is that low area of low pressure more or less in the central part of the country. So bringing storms northward probably won't be a big deal. However, what you don't see is that big high pressure in the eastern Atlantic or the Canadian Maritimes is replaced with low pressure. And there's also a little bit of a low pressure showing up just off the east coast. So basically, any storms that somehow survive the MDR and try to come northward are probably going to be deflected, or at least a pretty good chance. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to, but there is a pretty good chance that several of them will. And then of course, the other area is that anything that can form in the Caribbean or in the Gulf of Mexico will also be able to come northward. So that's quite a difference between the active landfall period of 2020. So again, the summary here real quick. Stronger than average 500 millibar low can be expected over the central U.S. No blocking high pressure over the Atlantic to drive storms into the U.S., so greater chances for recurring storms. However, the pattern does suggest some landfall risk for the Gulf of Mexico and the southeast coast. So let's wrap all this up into a forecast here for the tropics. And we're going to go with 13 named storms this year, pretty close to the analog average right now. 7 hurricanes and 3 major hurricanes. So our reduced risk will be located, as you might expect, across the MDR through the Caribbean Sea. However, we're going to go with near average risks. So if we're going to have storms that develop, and tracked, I think this will be the better chances for where the landfalls might be. So Florida, east of New Orleans, places like that. We'll have to probably keep a close eye on these a little bit more. But I think one message that you want to drive home here is that even though we're favoring that area, it doesn't mean any other area is in the clear. So even though it could be mostly quiet in these reduced risk area, if you get one or two big storms where you can get one blip in the pattern that allows that to happen, then the Western Gulf or any of these other places where it says reduced risk could obviously have a large impact. As we mentioned earlier, just one storm in a bad area will definitely be a big problem. You'll remember the season forever. Let's take 1992 for example, where they only had eight named storms. So by all, it'd be a quiet season. But one of those storms was Hurricane Andrew, and people in South Florida will never forget that year because of that, even though it was a quiet year. So that's important to remember that even though we're forecasting a reduced amount of hurricane activity, you have to keep your guard up at all times because all it takes is one storm, and and everything changes. Here's a quick look at the 2023 Atlantic storm names, and hopefully we don't have to get to too many of these. Hopefully Tammy and Vince and Whitney can be saved for another year. But we'll start with Arlene whenever that comes. So far we've had 0 though. So our key messages from the tropical section: conditions appear favorable for a less active season in the Atlantic due to El Nino, which historically reduces activity. Model guidance shows warmer than normal water temperatures and reduced wind shear in the Gulf of Mexico and near the southeast coast. And this can give you this can do a couple of things. It can give you some of these close-in homegrown type systems where it could develop in the Gulf of Mexico or near the southeast coast, at kind of the last minute. And also, the water temperatures being so warm, there could be some strengthening that comes closer to the coast. So which means we could have reduced lead time for some of these storms. So that could be another problem. It's gonna be hard to get stuff prepared if you have reduced lead time. So late summer and fall, the analog ECMWF precipitation and the storm tracks all show the best landfall risk in the eastern Gulf of Mexico and southeast U.S. coast, but that doesn't mean it can't go other places. Could get one or two road storms that go in another direction during a blip in the pattern, and again, you'll remember it forever. Early season activity is possible, especially in the Gulf of Mexico. And the most important thing, even if a weaker tropical system hits your area, it can still have significant landfall or significant impacts if it strikes a highly vulnerable location. With that, I'm going to pass it to Steve, who's going to tell us all about the summer season. Take it away, Steve.
Thank you very much, Nate, for walking us through the tropical season outlook. And now we'll change gears just a little bit and take a look at the summer outlook in terms of temperature, precipitation, wind speeds, and those type of variables. So first off, looking at the summer temperature pattern for this upcoming summer season, you will notice right off the bat on our seasonal composite on the left-hand side that most of the heat we're looking for does appear to be focused across the western third to half of the country. So most of the Rockies, especially, and then down into Texas as well. But across the Midwest Ohio Valley area there, you can see closer to average overall. So certainly a lot of areas in the eastern half of the country not looking to see a severe summer in terms of heat. Also notice down towards Florida could average closer to average as well. And again, potentially seeing more rainfall from tropical systems helping to further suppress temperatures just a little bit. On the month-by-month outlook, you can see for June, most of the southern and western U.S. is favored to average hotter than normal. As we head towards July and August, though, you'll notice a general trend towards the northwest getting hotter. Still heat, though, lingering from Texas into the southwest, but a large area of the Midwest into the southeast does appear to average fairly close to average. We could still see temperatures stay a little bit warmer across the Northeast with the main trough position a little bit west of them. So we'll have to watch for those occasional bursts of heat up there this summer season, but not likely seeing a prolonged run of this, endless heat for a lot of the eastern U.S. this year. So overall, a little bit more seasonal eastern half of the country, but certainly still looking to be quite hot across the western U.S. In terms of rainfall, the summer average looks to favor the higher rainfall potential along the East Coast as well as down towards Florida. So again, that will be partially dependent down there on the hurricane development and where we see tropical systems make landfall. So currently, again, the higher risk area is down there towards Florida. And so if we do see some tropical systems, that will easily keep rainfall above average for the summer average. But if those tropical systems fail to pan out down there, then rainfall may end up closer to average. But overall, in general, the eastern US should be a little bit wetter this summer, and areas in the plains and up to the northwest is likely going to stay generally drier. We already do have drought in place across parts of Texas up towards Kansas and Colorado, and so the drier outlook will likely lead to that drought condition area staying the same, or if not expanding with time. And generally speaking, during the summer, areas that are drier do tend to heat up faster, and we do tend to see more heat. So we could see, again, that south central part of the country stay hotter because, at least in part, of the drought conditions that are still in place across that region. As we kind of look here at the CDD outlook for the summer season, you can see the trends here over the past 40 years. So certainly a strong upward trend in the overall amount of cooling degree days during the last 40 years. Now, this is May to September, and one thing that's been kind of notable is the general trend towards hotter Mays and Septembers. There hasn't been as much of a trend during the core of the summer, but we've generally tended to see a longer summer period as time has gone on. And so that has helped to really boost the seasonal CDD totals quite a bit. So in terms of how this year looks to rank to past years, we currently have this as the 11th hottest. Generally speaking, years that do have an El Nino do tend to see lower CDD totals, again, because like we are forecasting this year, we may see the core of the heat across the Rockies, possibly though down into Texas as well. But generally speaking, with the core of the heat in a lot of the interior West, it's a lower populated area. And so with the eastern, part of the US where a larger part of the population is not being as warm, that will likely tend to hold down the CDD totals a little bit. Obviously, if we do see the heat across the South end up being a little stronger, in Texas, that could help to boost things a little bit higher than what we're forecasting here. But nonetheless, the overall idea here is that we should be higher than the 30-year average for the country as a whole, but not as hot as last summer. So looking at those drought conditions, again, there's a strong correlation between drought and summer temperatures across, especially the central part of the country. And we still have quite a bit of severe drought in place across the Plains region. And so we'll be watching that area closely here as we head through the balance of the spring, since typically as we head into May and early June, that's the wettest time of the year for a lot of these areas. And so we can, erode drought pretty fast at that time of the year if we do get a few storm systems that really bring a lot of rainfall at that time. But if those rains kind of fail this year, then we'll be heading into summer with severe drought already in place. And then typically things turn markedly drier as we head into the middle part of June and through the rest of the summer across the plains. And so likely we'll see an expansion of drought if that happens, and those areas will be favored to be hotter than average. Despite all the rain and snow we've seen across the West this year, there is still areas of drought present. A lot of the mountains of California obviously have abundant snowpack, as do some of the mountains of Colorado and other areas. But there are still areas that have kind of missed out to some extent and do have drought remaining. And as we do see temperatures stay hotter than average this summer season across that area, likely those areas that have drought currently will see the drought turn a little bit more severe. And we could see some slow expansion of that drought as we progress through the summer season. But obviously, there are areas that are very wet, and so those areas likely will be more resistant to drought formation. But nonetheless, the overall trend will be drier and hotter as we move forward here during the balance of the spring and into the summer season. Looking at severe weather so far, it has been a very active year. There's obviously been some very notable outbreaks of tornadoes thus far. So we are running well ahead of average on the tornado totals for the year, already around 540 for the season so far. So very solidly ahead of average. And then on the left-hand side, you can see the locations of all the severe weather events that have happened in terms of wind, hail, and tornadoes. If you look at just tornadoes and just the severe hail reports, you can kind of see those areas that have been primarily impacted. So really from eastern Iowa, Illinois, southeastward into the southeast has been the primary area for tornadoes thus far. Likely we'll see some of that shift westward as we progress through the rest of the spring season. As we get towards the plains, typically see the most of their activity as we head through May into early June. So likely we will see an uptick in those areas going forward. But you can see hail has been pretty abundant from Texas up towards Illinois as well so far this spring season. So what will impact the severe weather during the remainder of the spring? Well, one thing, there's two components, obviously, is having the moisture supply and the typical contrast of air masses and storm tracks that promote a lot of thunderstorms. But you also, to get the severe weather, need a lot of wind shear. Unlike hurricanes, which don't like wind shear, severe storms do. And so where we see typically the stronger winds aloft is often where we tend to see the more abundant areas of severe thunderstorm activity. And so as we head through the summer season, there is an indication we could see more wind shear than average, or just more winds, or more stronger winds aloft at least than average across the north central US. So a lot of the upper Midwest does stand the potential to have perhaps a more active severe weather season as we progress into the early part of the summer season. So if you look month by month in terms of the areas that look to see the most risk for severe weather, this is basically just thunderstorms in general, but you can see for May, pretty much a large area of the eastern half of the country, which is typical for May, will have a risk for thunderstorms. But as we progress into June and July, that risk area does look to shift northward into the upper Midwest. And again, with the stronger winds forecast across the upper Midwest this summer season, and more thunderstorms likely in those areas as well, we could see more severe weather than typical across the upper Midwest as we head into the early part of the summer season. However, we should see severe weather generally abate for most areas, and it should be a quieter than average storm pattern as we head through the latter half of the summer season. So kind of looking at the overall summary for the summer here, across the Northwest, we do look to see a hot and dry summer overall. And so again, we should see some expansion of a drought that is still lingering across portions of that region. And again, with some areas still in drought, we likely will see an increase in wildfire risk as we head through the latter part of the summer season, and those conditions dry out further with time. Across the Southwest and California, we should see those areas remain warmer than normal for most of the summer. The one exception will be likely right along the immediate West Coast. We do have that colder water in place off the West Coast, and so the LA basin, San Francisco, those areas right along the coast will have a harder time getting hot as long as that colder water remains in place. And so while the interior California should be hotter than average, the coastal areas, at least for the first half of the summer, will likely have a harder time seeing any hot weather get into those areas, at least with any kind of regularity. If we do see the waters warm with time, which the models do project, we could see more risk for heat along the immediate West Coast by the very tail end of the summer season towards September. Across the central US, again, the north central US, warmer than average overall. We could see some early summer dryness, but potentially more rainfall during the second half of the summer season. The south central US, though, does look to stay hotter and generally drier than average. And again, we do have drought already in place in those areas, so we could see the drought conditions worsen with time, and that should help to enhance the heat across those areas. Across the eastern half of the country, the story will generally be the same, the southeast and the northeast, with temperatures near to moderately warmer than average for the summer as a whole, with higher than average rainfall. So one aspect of the pattern this year will likely be fewer extreme heat days because we are going to likely see the wetter conditions across those areas. However, with the added rainfall will come added humidity. So while we may not see as many days reach, say above 95 degrees across a lot of the eastern US, there will be a lot more days that are, in the upper 80s, maybe near 90, but have, higher than average humidity. So we may still see periods of weather where we have very high heat indices, even without very high absolute temperatures. Now, if we look at the renewable side of things here, looking at the wind outlook for the summer season, the main area of enhanced winds does look to be across parts of the plains, eastern Rockies, so Colorado, Nebraska, southward into the Texas Panhandle. That does happen to be also the area with a very high concentration of wind generation capacity. And so overall, we could see more wind generation than typical this summer season, with the winds being kind of focused across the areas that do have a lot of wind farms. And so you can see month by month there, June through August. June, basically Kansas southward could see elevated winds, and then shifting northward into July, but then pretty expansive above average winds across the central US, as well as most of the Southwest and Rockies as we head to the latter part of summer during August. Now, on the sun side of things, overall, more sun than average is forecast across a large area of the sort of central and southeastern US, especially during June. Again, as we head to the latter part of the summer season, the Southwest, South Central US likely being sunnier than average. The Southwest will largely depend on how active the monsoon season is there. So if we do see less rainfall than average as is currently forecast, then we could, in turn, we would tend to see more sun than average across the Southwest and Rockies. So key messages for the summer season. The main focus, again, of the heat looks to be across the western half of the country. So the Southwest Rockies, especially likely seeing a hot summer this year, or hotter than average. It's always hot typically in the Southwest, but likely more days in that extreme heat range in Phoenix and Las Vegas and those areas there. But east of the plains, most areas likely coming in only modestly warmer than average for the summer season. The drought in the Northwest, as well as the South Central US, will be a focus, though. Those drought areas should worsen this summer season. And so those will be areas that will likely tend to see an enhancement of the heat as the summer goes on. Again, the wet pattern across the East Coast will likely prevail for most of the season, and that will also tend to enhance humidity in those areas. The thunderstorm risk areas will be highest around the Great Lakes, upper Midwest area, and then into the Northeast as well, especially during June and July. But we could see a general reduction of thunderstorms as we head into August. And again, could be a favorable year for wind generation. The higher than average wind speeds forecast across a lot of the Western Plains area this summer season should promote more wind generation than usual as we head through the core of the summer season. And again, most of the South looking to see more sun than average. So with the summer outlook here wrapped up, you may see a 4-question poll pop up, but now we're going to bring on Brad Nelson and Kevin Stinson and talk about basically how you can use this weather information that we just shared to manage risk for your industry.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I am just trying to stop sharing the presentation. So maybe need to take that back. But while we figure that out, I want to welcome my two panelists, Brad Nelson and Kevin Stinson. And they are here to help discuss how these impacts can, I'm still trying to figure out how to stop sharing, how these weather impacts affect our different industries. So with that, first, we just heard the long range forecast for the upcoming summer months. What do these warm season thunderstorms and tropical impacts mean for your industries? So Brad, let's start with you. Can you tell us what this means for those planning outdoor events like concerts, festivals, sports, fairs, etc.?
Yeah, Andrea, certainly can. Hello, everyone. So as we see conditions start to warm up, things become more humid heading into the spring and summer months, we tend to see a ramping up of large outdoor concerts, sports, and live events. So really having that actionable plan for every type of inclement weather scenario is critically important. It's not only maintaining safety, but it's for the overall success and logistics of these actual events. So these plans need to have that professional weather support and focus in order to be properly executed. And that's kind of where we at DTN really help our customer partners as well. So there are a number of factors to consider, right? It's not only the risks of lightning, the high thunderstorm outflow winds, or the heavy rain and flooding from general thunderstorms and heavy rain, but also tropical systems. It's the extreme heat and others. So being prepared ahead of time and making the smart right decision in the heat of the moment is really important for every situation. So in the case of a tropical system or a hurricane bearing down on your event, that decision needs to be made days ahead of time to cancel a show or a sporting event, move it to a different location or a time, which could be a huge logistical and public relations nightmare, right? So that lead time to these storms impacts are vital. And as Nate has suggested, we're going to see weaker shear in the Gulf of Mexico, which may allow for storms to form quickly in this area later in the summer and fall. And unfortunately means less lead time due to the already close proximity to the US mainland. So that's where our DTN products and solutions come in, consulting with an expert meteorologist and risk communicator, providing that support is so critical.
Thanks, Brad. Kevin, what about for airport operations?
All right, I'm unmuted now. Yeah, so for the airport operations, I think the word operations a lot of times can be a pretty big catch-all, right? So if we look at an airport perspective from our internal views, DTN, as we work with many of you, is it's quite complex. No two airports are the same. No two operational plans, even though operational plans are mandated, of course, that is your day-to-day, how you implement those. But there are several points along there that weather becomes important. So how do we turn that into a shared action plan? How we work from a DTN perspective. So think about from an airline. From an airline perspective, how are the operations being handled at the gateway? Well, that may be under the purview, depending on the airport structure of the airline itself, or it may fall along the operations at the airport. Think about if a storm, think pre, post, and after storm were to damage the security perimeter, you have to re-secure the airport. And many times we think about the airport perspective. We're talking about the air side, but we need to also think about the land side. So how about any of the road or the infrastructure that's coming in and to out of that airport, and how is that being cared for? Then think about within the overall terminal itself. You can think about terminals that have been hit by tornadoes in the past, such as St. Louis Lambert. So these operational plans, whether they're EOCs that are being set up, whether they're completely filed plans, DTN becomes a unique perspective there because we understand all the different supply chain and the business continuity that can have effects across there. So it's not just the weather forecast coming out, it's the weather forecast being tuned to the operations that's important for air side, land side, and terminal operations.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, that's so important. Are there any other summer weather conditions that can affect operations, both for event planning operations and airport operations? One thing that I'm thinking specifically about is extreme heat. So, Kevin, why don't we start with you and then we'll go to Brad.
Yeah, I think one of the obvious that come to mind around extreme heat is just worker safety, right? So if we think about, oppressive heat out onto the airfield during normal times, well, think, what if this is post-event? And post-event, depending on how the electricity is microgridded at the airport, what's available for cooling facilities? Think about the push down effects from that as the weather pushes out to the crews that have to be called in. What about their concerns about their loved ones at home? So there becomes a pretty big effort that comes through all the way from. So the extreme heat in some could be just the day-to-day kind of operations that you're working in, but it could also mean a completely different thing during some kind of a natural disaster.
Great. And Brad?
Yeah, heat is a big one that can impact outdoor events and sports. There's so many additional decisions that need to be factored in, such as purchasing extra water, right? Providing cold towels, cooling stations, moving gates around to spread people out more, providing shade, or even moving a show or game time to cooler times of day or a completely different day when you're talking about extreme circumstances. Another big one is in the event of flooding and heavy rain. That could be from thunderstorms, large cyclones in the mid-latitude cyclones and storms to tropical systems. Logistics decisions need to be made on maintaining the integrity of the grounds, including parking, hauling in tons of crushed rock or mulch to improve footing conditions, getting more staff on hand, and then potentially moving the show or game as well to a different date. And as Nate mentioned in the outlook, flooding impacts from hurricanes can be well inland across the interior of the North American continent. He even mentioned some of those into the upper Midwest and northern plains from post tropical systems that move well into the interior. So it's important to stay well versed on ahead of those kind of situations that may occur. Another one is even reduced visibilities that can have, due to fog and marine layer along coastlines, can have major impacts to outdoor events as well. So those are some of the kind of the main ones that come to mind when you're talking about other type of conditions that you may not come to mind first off.
Great. And, with all of these weather events that can happen, what type of tools do event organizers or airport operation managers need to help plan for these severe weather events? So, Brad, let's start with you.
Yeah, kick that off. I mean, DTN is a vast suite of product solutions and solutions we can assist in helping make, these key decisions ahead of and during periods of inclement weather, impactful weather. We can tailor a solution to best suit your needs and the key decisions that you need to make. So that ranges from our online and mobile applications, which feature, that plethora of information, a one-stop shop of all your needs and your alerting needs, to our meteorologist and risk communicator consultation, directly speaking with the meteorologists in our weather rooms and our expert risk communicators that are, they understand your key decisions you're making and understand your impacts and your operational challenges. So, having that professional meteorologist in the loop that's already connected with you, knows the decisions you got to make, how long it takes to evacuate your property, is really critical for large outdoor events. And our risk communicator team is dedicated to providing that full dedicated support during adverse, challenging weather. One thing we found, especially in the last few years, is that our customer partners really value having one or two meteorologists they're working with through every show, every sporting event, every significant weather event, and providing that value consultation and actionable insights. That allows really the event organizers and the safety managers to be well prepared for and respond accordingly to weather conditions. Helps them make confident decisions instead of having to wait things out and make a somewhat educated guess on the information that is being provided.
Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, I think Brad, you kind of hit on some broad themes that easily carry over into the airport operations world. It's one, we all have a plan, and how does weather fit into that plan, right? So weather, generally, you have the forecast, you have the risks around that forecast. How is that forecast changing? What's the confidence in that forecast? So there's a number of factors that go around that that become important. And so what can happen sometimes if it's not one voice across weather, there can be competing weather thoughts. And those competing weather thoughts can then also create additional uncertainty. And many times we may be able to talk to those kind of competing weather thoughts. So, for example, a lot of the companies we work with are third-party technology companies that may provide mass communications. Our weather forecasts are working in through those to be able to provide different kinds of outlooks, whatever the trigger may be for a larger operational environment. We may be integrated with another technology partner for some kind of situational awareness tool that you have up within your operations center. You may be working with us directly with our applications that Brad highlighted to be able to really get that fine tuned. But in the end, having that meteorologist over the loop helps explain and give the confidence behind that forecast. And if we're brought in soon enough and structure that, now we're hooked in with your operational plans, of which then we're designed in and around that so that we can help manage all that from a one weather, one voice kind of perspective. Andrew, you may be on mute.
Thank you. I could have sworn I hit unmute. Brad and Kevin, thank you so much for this discussion. And so now we're going to transition into the Q&A. I know we got a few questions coming in on the chat, but if anybody has any questions about what Brad and Kevin were talking about, or what anything that Stephen and Nate presented earlier, please either put it in on the Q&A feature on the right-hand side of your screen or the chat feature, and we will go through them. So I will turn this over to Nate and Stephen to go through those questions.
Hey, thanks, Andrea, and thanks, Brad and Kevin. It's very important to point out what not only what the forecast is, but what we can all do with it. What everybody can do with the forecast once you have it, how it will impact you. So thank you for that context. First question that I saw that came in was, oh, my video started here. First question was question 37, slide 37, where the temperatures in degrees Celsius or Fahrenheit. That was degrees Fahrenheit. So for the US, we deal with degrees Fahrenheit, and we'll continue to do so. So that was the first question. Another question that came in is, what about the Eastern Pacific hurricane season? You mentioned that the Atlantic might be down, but does that mean that the Eastern Pacific might be increased? I'll take that one. But if you remember back where I showed the current sea surface temperatures and the forecast sea surface temperature, there's a ton of warm water in the Eastern Pacific right now. And and this El Nino is forming there first. So a lot of the warm water is developing off the South American coastline, eventually spreading westward. So right now, south of Mexico, there's 30 degrees Celsius or 86 degrees Fahrenheit water sitting right there. And that's already favorable for tropical development. So in a lot of years where you have El Nino, you'll have a lot more shear across the Atlantic basin, which causes that to come down, but there's less shear and warmer water in the Eastern Pacific. So that particular basin should be more active this summer with greater threats of landfalling type storms. So anybody with interest along the Mexican coastline or even further west potentially, maybe even into Hawaii, if the water can be warm enough out there. Something you have to watch out this summer. The only thing you have to watch out for is the breadth of water that's off of the west coast right now. If that doesn't warm up fast enough, that could actually be a kind of a hindrance, especially further west. So that's the only real negative I can see on there. But all in all, an active season in the Eastern Pacific is anticipated. Well, let's see. Maybe this one's for Steve. A lot of severe weather happened so far this year, and there's been a lot of activity that's developed more or less in the Mississippi Valley and then spread eastward with a lot of wind through the parts of the Midwest and the South. Do you feel like this real active stretch is going to continue, or do you think we're going to see this settle down as we get into the summer?
Well, it does look like it should continue here for at least into the early part of the summer season. I think by late summer we are going to see less severe weather activity than typical, but overall the pattern looks to be fairly favorable. It's actually not unusual when we come out of a La Nina and transition into an El Nino. We often see a fairly strong southwest to northeast flow at times across the central U.S. A lot of storm systems tracking that way, and so we have a lot of opportunities for storms. And so that will likely continue here as we go forward for the next couple of months at least, likely through June, then before maybe gradually quieting down. But we kind of showed earlier that there is a general tendency for the upper Midwest to be fairly active as we head into June and July. So while May will likely see a lot of severe weather across, even into Texas, a lot of the traditional plains areas that get it, as we head into June and July, we may see most of that activity get focused more towards the northern half of the central U.S., so Minnesota, Iowa, northern Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, and into the Northeast as well. So likely this overall above average trend should continue probably for another 3 months, the way it looks right now. So no real early end to it the way it looks right now at this point.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Steve. All right, another question came in. With El Nino building to weak levels by late summer, do you think that should enhance variability across the East and further limit our CDD outlook this summer? Do we have a risk range? Well, I guess maybe the best way to answer the question, pose the question would be, do you think that the building El Nino will have any kind of downside risks to the summer CDD totals?
So generally speaking, the stronger and faster the El Nino develops, the lower the CDD totals you typically end up in general, for the U.S. as a whole. And again, a lot of that's depending on what happens across the eastern U.S. where the higher population areas are. So the risk really, I think, is that we don't see the El Nino develop as fast as what the models project, or it just gets delayed a little bit, even if it does develop quickly late in the summer season. And so that would tend to allow the heat to potentially end up being a little more expansive than what we currently have forecast, if that happens. So if the El Nino is a little sluggish to get going here, and the one risk there is that we do have all that cold water off the West Coast. Some of that will kind of get pulled down into the tropical areas of the Pacific just by the circulation patterns. And so if that kind of slows the El Nino warming trend, that would be the main risk for more heat than what is currently forecast. Conversely, if we go straight into a stronger El Nino by August, where we're plus 1.5 C in the main Nino 3-4 region, then the risk for extensive heat will be less. So a lot of it will be dependent on how fast the El Nino develops, because a stronger El Nino typically brings more rainfall to the eastern U.S. And so that typically is what helps to suppress the overall intensity of the heat during the summer season.
Great answer. Thank you, Steve. All right, well, maybe I have time for one more here. With the steering flow pulling systems north and west, would that tend to pull any systems that develop in the Gulf quickly towards the Florida Peninsula? I'll take that one. I guess the short answer would be kind of yes. The steering flow is certainly favorable for dragging storms northward that may come out of the Caribbean or actually form in the Gulf towards the Gulf Coast and beyond. But as we talked about a little bit earlier, there is some evidence that some of these storms tend to slow down a little bit as they approach the coast. We've seen a trend of that, especially some of the stronger ones here. And the idea that there's going to be a lot of warm water all the way up to landfall gives us the idea that we could have some significant strengthening in certain situations of a storm that could be of nothing 2 days ago. So, I mean, those are the types of things we're going to have to watch out for. So whether it goes towards the Florida Peninsula or whether it goes into the Central Gulf, or lower probability, but even they could go into the Western Gulf. Every single storm that comes in there this summer, it's going to have to be watched very carefully for those impacts. I think we're 2 after the hour, so I probably should hand it back to Andrea for closing remarks.
Great. Thank you, Nathan. Thanks, Stephen, Kevin, and Brad for this great discussion and presentation today. We have recorded this webinar, so we will be sending out the recording in a few days to everybody that has registered. So with that, I hope everybody has a great rest of your day. Thank you.